Hey, it's John, and welcome to the interview. Today, I'm joined by Rand Stagen, who is the Managing Director of the Stagen Leadership Academy. The Academy trains leaders from across North America who are committed to long-term personal development and using their organizational platforms for positive impact. Rand is a passionate advocate for elevating humanity through business. He's also a founding board member and past chairman of Conscious Capitalism International. Rand, thanks so much for coming by today.
Well, it's great to be here with you, John. Thank you for the invitation.
You bet, you bet. So let's just fill people in on your background, the Reader's Digest version of who Rand is as a human being and how you've gotten to this point, and then we'll jump into the questions.
Sure. I would imagine, like a lot of the people listening today, I most identify with being an entrepreneur. So when I was in college in Texas at SMU in Dallas, I started a publishing company when I was a sophomore, and that publishing company actually became my first and only job, really, because after graduating, I started a series of regional newspapers and magazines and built a small publishing company with about 50 employees while I was in my 20s. And because I just didn't know much about leading, I didn't know much about managing, I was very fortunate to have been introduced to something called executive coaching, which I hired my first executive coach when I was 23. And I really experienced the benefit of having a guide, a mentor, a Sherpa that was there to introduce me to Stephen Covey and his body of work, introduce me to Tony Robbins and his body of work, and so many others. And so in 1999, February of '99, which is just so great to be with you because this is our 20th anniversary just a month ago.
Congratulations!
Thank you. I sold the publishing company and started Stagen Leadership Academy, and the academy, working with an incredible group of co-founders and faculty. Over the last 20 years, we have built an organization, and I really call it a community of now having the language of a community of conscious capitalists. And our clients are leaders from all over North America who come to Dallas to participate in development programs. And one of the things that's unique, we have a brick and mortar facility right on the edge of downtown Dallas in an area called Turtle Creek. And so our clients do fly to us for a part of their development programs, which is the physical workshops. But in between their quarterly workshops, there is a practice-based philosophy that we use to help them change behaviors and become more effective as leaders. So it's a very intense process. Surprisingly to those that don't know our brand, our shortest offering for new clients is a 52-week practice-based exec ed program that starts almost exclusively with the CEO of the business. So we've been very fortunate to work with hundreds of organizations all over the United States with the CEOs first, and then in some cases with several or even dozens of their top leaders. And that's us in a nutshell. We're in the business of helping leaders become more effective. And depending on where our conversation goes, we might even get to our real passion, which is how the tools for helping leaders become more effective, things like learning how to get more done in less time, learning how to prioritize, learning how to delegate, learning how to manage energy. We really are passionate about helping leaders sort of clear out the clutter and clear out the noise and actually use that space that has been created to do what we're most up to, which is deep inner work with leaders that you and I could call conscious leadership development. So we've learned that we can't ask leaders who are incredibly engaged in their businesses to just become more conscious if they can't get their to-do list done and if they're overwhelmed and overworked. So our programs tend to sequence effectiveness, and then we earn the right to do the deeper work that we're most passionate about on the other side of that. So that's us.
Yeah, and we'll dig into some of that stuff. Those are a couple of questions I wanted to dig into because it's really hard when you're pulled into your to-do list to really zoom out and do that kind of big picture work. So I'm going to touch on some of those things in a second. But if you could boil all of that down, here's the marketing trick here, right? Like if you could boil all that down into like who you serve and what you do for them and how you help them, I mean, is there a specific size of business? For everybody listening to this, like what types of businesses? I know you work with the CEOs first, but can you elaborate on like who you
Sure.
work with specifically and how you help in kind of a nutshell version of that?
Yeah, we work with leaders who are willing to play the long game in their development and the development of their organizations. Because of that philosophical stand, we tend to work with privately held businesses that are entrepreneur-led or family-led. And those businesses tend to have the luxury of playing a longer-term time horizon in their business. So we'll call that the sort of privately held mid-sized businesses would be our niche. Now, we do work with some exceptions in the public markets, work with a handful of public companies where the CEOs are actually in a position where they are willing to take a stand for the long-term health of their business. But with today's environment, with activist investors and with short-termism, it's really hard for CEOs of public companies to commit to our structure and our methodology.
Right. Okay, perfect. And so, and everybody listening can check that out at Stagen.com. I believe that's right. Is it Stagen.com? And we'll link that up below this video as well. And if you're listening on iTunes or Stitcher Radio, you can check out Stagen. That's STAGEN.com. Is that correct? STAGEN.com. Yeah. Got to spell that. I was a little dyslexic as a kid here, so I think that came out okay. So anyway, yeah. So let's switch gears and talk a little more about leadership as a whole, and let's geek out for a little bit here because this kind of stuff is fascinating stuff. I guess we'll start with a kind of a fun topic, and I believe was it you who said it or someone else? I can't remember, but it's don't ask the market necessarily what it needs. Ask yourself what brings you to life, because what the market needs is more people who've been brought to life. I think you might have said that at some point.
No. I'm laughing because there's no authorship in that. That's that quote is attributed to a contemporary of Martin Luther King, a civil rights leader named Howard Thurman.
Okay.
And there's different versions of it, but the version that I love is don't ask what the world needs. Ask what brings you alive, and then go do that, because what the world needs is people who have come alive, right?
Right.
This is
right.
So
what brings you alive then? What gets Rand excited? Like, what's that big thing that gets your blood pumping?
Yeah, I'm a very curious person, and my wife would say possibly too curious. I'm always asking waiters, waitresses, managers, retailers about their business, about their store, about their culture, and so I think my curiosity is something that keeps me alive, and being afforded the opportunity to be in relationship with people who are open and are committed to the journey of what we might call sort of lifelong learning is what I am most passionate about, and what lights me up is just being around people that want to learn and grow.
Absolutely. What was it, Einstein who said that, I'm not a genius, I'm just passionately curious? Is that the quote?
Yeah, he is obviously a big exemplar of curiosity.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. So elaborate. Another statement you made was that leaders get the organizations they deserve.
Yeah.
Leaders get the organizations that they deserved. I mean, can you elaborate on that a little bit for people?
Sure. Yeah, we in our 2 decades, and I really consider myself after 20 years of doing this work, I really feel like, and this is not I'm not just saying this, to be dramatic. I feel like we have just finished a warm-up lap as a business, and it took us a couple of decades to mature our model, to identify where we could create the most impact and the most value, our sort of segmentation that you and I just spoke about. And so I'm lit up about the opportunity to really start our business, and very grateful for the thousands of leaders that we've been able to work with up to this point. But we're ready to play much bigger, and we can talk about what that means to us at some point, possibly in the conversation. But I would say that we're the curiosity and the ability to work with people that are really committed to this journey has had me look at the patterns to answer this question of where did that statement come from. And after about 15 years, and I didn't say those words until then, Someone said to me, Rand, you've been in the leadership space for a long time. If you had to just abstract up to just kind of one big pattern, what pattern do you see? And the pattern that I saw is that leaders get the organization they deserve. And when I'm around leaders who take responsibility for leadership, we can hear a pin drop in a room. If I'm with 300 people in an audience and I'm giving a speech, especially like a group of 300 entrepreneurs who are the founders of the business, and I say, guys, gals, this thing you call your organization is actually a giant mirror of you. And so whatever you're satisfied with and whatever you're frustrated with isn't about the organization, it's about you, because you are the organization. As you go, so goes your organization. And when I talk to leaders, especially founders, I'll ask them, tell me what's happening in your business, and they'll start to complain because they care, they're passionate. They complain about their head of sales and their COO, and they're not able to do their job, and they can't give me the information I need to make good decisions. And there'll be a lot of what Bob Keegan, who ran the adult psychology department at Harvard for 40 years, who's been a mentor and kind of a big influence to us through his work, he calls it BMW language, bitching, moaning, whining language. And he said in a Fast Company interview, which was great, he said, bitching and moaning and whining on the surface looks like it's a bad thing, but the reality is behind every complaint is a commitment, because people don't complain unless they care. And so these entrepreneurs and leaders, professional hired guns, they'll passionately complain, and then I'll do a timeout and I'll say, hold on a second. You said you're unhappy with these 3 execs. Who hired those 3 execs? And then silence. Well, who's responsible for making sure that those execs are in the right seat on the bus? Who's responsible for making sure they have the right tools, the coaching, the training to be effective? And at the end of the day, the conversation will come back to the person I'm sitting with. They are the root cause of all of their complaints. So stop complaining and start taking responsibility, and step into that responsibility by recognizing, and this is another big idea, organizations don't change. People do. So if you want to transform a business, I don't know any way to transform a business, because I don't believe, and our team does not believe, that organizations inherently change. What we believe is that human beings who lead organizations actually change. Either they're changed because they're different people, or they have grown and developed into different people. But that's the big idea here, is it's all about the leaders. And that's sort of the little bit the story behind that statement.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, there's individual human beings in the business, not just some like nebulous thing called business that's out there, right? Yeah. And it starts at the top, right? I mean, I've talked to a number of executive coaches as well too, and you want to know why the business is struggling. It's usually the leader in the leading group, and often the personal lives of these people too are a mess, so they can't perform well, or things like that. So there's a lot of depth to that, I'm sure. So what are some of the characteristics and habits that you see? Like, let's say you did this exercise with somebody, and what kind of characteristics do you see from a leader that's a conscious leader, that's somebody who's doing a great job at leading this organization?
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously a big question. We can go in a variety of different areas. I think that fundamentally, one of the most important attributes or characteristics that we see in highly conscious and highly effective leaders is their general orientation as a learner, sort of sometimes called the mindset of the learner. We call it we have a framework in our curriculum that differentiates the hallmarks between the mindset of the knower versus the mindset of the learner. And many of your listeners have probably heard about this idea of fixed mindsets versus fluid mindsets. And so that right there, I'm going to say, is probably a prerequisite for the kind of leaders that we admire, and the kind of leaders that we're trying to help build in our work at the Academy. And so if a leader is able to have an orientation to this idea that no matter how knowledgeable I am, I can still maintain an orientation or a mindset of lifelong learning. And if I'm oriented to lifelong learning, then everything I interact with as a leader, because it's a feedback-rich environment being a leader, everything I interact with, every problem, every challenge, every person, every customer, every employee is actually feedback. And if I'm in this sort of dance with life, that I am shaping and being shaped by my reality, and I'm in the mindset of a learner, then I have a chance to always be growing. And there's a statement, I don't know where this comes from, that someone shared with me just recently, that the present moment is the guru, right? Is that each moment is the guru. And when I am most triggered, when I'm most angry, when I'm most defensive, when I'm most frustrated, I can do what most people do, which is I can blame the other person. And here's the language that is often accompanying the blame. She made me angry. He made me upset. She made me frustrated, as opposed to reclaiming our agency and saying, nobody can make me feel those things. Those emotions are mine. And then here's the hard part. And you ask about what great leaders do. I think this is what great leaders do. They say, wow, what a gift to be in a relationship or to be in a conversation. That conversation revealed in me my own inability to respond skillfully and resourcefully. And the reason I got defensive or frustrated wasn't because of them. That's my guru, that person, that conversation. What a gift it is to actually see that exposed in me, that I just am not capable of dealing with that conversation, that feedback, that that content, whatever that was going on there. And what a gift. Like, I'm surrounded by teachers all the time, and the ones that I'm around when I'm the most unresourced, when I'm the most back on my heels and defensive, are my greatest teachers, my greatest gifts. That is rare, right?
Yeah.
I'm telling it to you right now, and I'm saying that I am present to this sometimes, and other times I'm defensive and I'm frustrated and I'm blaming. And so that's a part of the answer I would start with.
Yeah. Now, I think a couple of things come to mind. There's one quote that I love that I'll share. I think it's from Eric Hoffer, who said that in times of change, learners inherit the earth, while the learned find themselves beautifully equipped to deal with a world that no longer exists.
Yeah.
That's pretty good.
It's a great concept.
Is it ego that stops us from being that learner? Is that really what it comes down to? Is our ego is challenged and we feel we're special or something as a leader, and because of that, we feel invalidated, as a human being? Is that why we refuse to take feedback like that?
Another big question. No easy answer there. A summary would be, at least in my observation of this, is not necessarily about ego, although ego is absolutely a part of this. A better way to describe, what we notice is a comfort zone. Okay. And so you gave a quote that talks about this idea of kind of a world that no longer exists. So let's play with this idea of reality, and let's use the metaphor of a map. And so and some of your listeners may know this kind of historical fact that when the Europeans were mapping the world, they obviously mapped territory, and they would draw the lines for the shore of the coast and islands, and that, let's just call that sort of the known world, the world that is mapped. And then there were parts of the world that for many generations were unmapped. They were uncharted territory. And to signify or symbolize uncharted territory, if one looks at ancient maps, one will see they'll write monsters and dragons and serpents, and they would sometimes accompany those images of these scary creatures with the words, "Here be dragons." And the message, which is now a little bit more kind of dramatically amplified in modern day, is that these parts of the map are uncharted territory. It's hostile, it's dangerous. to the sailors, don't go there. Now, the most adventurous sailors, Christopher Columbus would be a cliche example of that, actually looked at uncharted territory and said, that's actually where the richness of life is, and that's where the adventure of life is. So they would go on their, hero's journey and their adventure into the unknown, into the abyss, and psychologically, this can even be, into territory that we have no experience with. And so, for those that are watching, I've got my hands sort of, if I had a snow globe, I'm gonna pretend I have a snow globe here. Let's say this is a snow globe. Every one of us creates a comfort zone, and that comfort zone, signified with a snow globe, becomes our known world. And that known world, especially for people who are successful, is actually informed by this idea of a success formula, or what we call a winning formula. And if I'm an entrepreneur, or if I'm a professional manager, or if I'm a functional leader in a business, I have achieved my level of success by applying a winning formula that is represented in this idea of a snow globe. And what happens, to answer your question, especially for the most successful people, is this paradox that the winning formula I use for a decade or two to create my current level of success paradoxically becomes the same formula that will hold me back from going to my next level. Right. And so this is what's surprising to people is when I tell them that the most successful people and the most successful leaders are actually the least likely to engage deep transformational change work because they have the most to lose. And so it's ego that is inside of this, but I believe that it is actually more of the comfort zone and the known world. And if you were to say, okay, Rand, well, why would those exceptions, those extraordinary leaders, why would they leave the familiarity that has intoxicated them? And our company works with people who are incredibly accomplished, business leaders, business owners, people who have more money than they can spend in their current generation. It's a multi-generational wealth. And they become very, very, very consumed with their maintaining and protecting their known world. And you'll say, well, okay, Rand, well, what would cause somebody to leave? And we believe there's only two causes. There's the cause which is more common, which is the leader is forced out of her comfort zone through pain, through a traumatic experience. It could be personal, it could be a divorce, it could be business, it could be a bankruptcy where they can no longer avoid, that they need to change. That's forced out. And then the other way is actually to choose out. Well, how do you choose out? You choose out by having a compelling vision for the future in which you would consciously, Christopher Columbus, step into uncharted territory. But here's the bottom line. In the absence of being forced out or choosing out, is the status quo. And there's a reason it's called the status quo, because that's where your comfort is. And so most of the people that we work with are coming to us because they're stuck, they're in pain, and that's the motivator. And some of our leaders will come to us and say, I'm wildly successful, and I realize that for me to have my next level of success, I'm going to need to actually put myself into uncharted territories and choose a compelling future for myself. But I'll be honest with you, that's definitely a small percentage of the leaders that we interact with.
It's mostly from pain or being forced in a certain situation. Yeah.
They're stuck. Yeah, they're stuck.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what get them to $100 million might not get them to $1 billion or 500 million, right? I mean, that's just a dramatically different situation. So I was like the saying, "What got me here won't get me there."
Yeah, so that saying, which is the title of a Marshall Goldsmith book, is something that really hits. You're right on. It really hits the sort of essence. What got you here, whatever your role is, won't get you there, which we call the performance paradox. The winning formula that got you here, paradoxically, is the very formula that will hold you back from going to the next level. And the last thing on this, is people will say, what's so hard about changing our winning formula? If you're an entrepreneur, you mentioned building a business, and you've built a $50 or $100 million business, and the winning formula that you've used, which by the way is a very successful person, micromanagement, being hands-on, staying close to the action, trusting your gut, all those things that are necessary to thrive at the lower levels of the corporate life cycle, those actually become the very things that hold the leader back from delegating, from letting go of control, from trusting data, not just their gut around marketing and around analytics. And so often leaders who build things get stuck and are not able to continue growing. And then when they're confronted with what's going to be required for them to create a new sense of identity, and all of a sudden their juice can't come from being the hero and micromanaging. Their juice has to come from getting work done through teams, and not just delegating, but actually delegating and coaching and mentoring other people. That is not, in our experience and in everything I've read, that is not an easy transition to make, because you're actually asking the leader to break down their own, sometimes we call it as a golf swing, break down their own golf swing and then rebuild themselves into a new swing. And when Tiger Woods, the most famous example of this, broke his golf swing down back in 2003-ish, he was the number one in the world, number one in rankings, number one in earnings, and he surprised the marketplace when he announced that he was firing his coach. He was changing his swing. He was changing his body shape from very thin to kind of broad, and people were so shocked, because in America, when you're the best, when you're number one, you don't actually break it down and change it. You stay with it. You ride it out. And he said in the interviews that we use sometimes in our research or in our speaking or in our papers, we'll quote him. And and his message is, that the very things that I used to create who I am today, number one in the world, by the way, he said, are the very things that are holding me back from going to this is subtle, my next level. And then the punchline is that for about 18 months, when Tiger was retooling himself, he had to endure failure. He had to endure ridicule. He had to endure criticism. And having you talk about leadership has so much to do with the courage to actually endure what is unnecessarily painful sometimes, like to put yourself into that kind of anxiety. And he was attacked. I mean, the cover stories of the sports pages about idiot, moron, why would he do this? And yet 18 months later, not only did he return to his level of performance and greatness, he actually went to higher levels that were shocking to his peers. So
right. No, that's a good analogy for that concept, and that's well put. And for everybody listening to this, as far as there's distinctions between one level of business versus the next level, and I think you put those out there very well. So thank you for that. Let's switch gears and talk a little bit about goal setting. I don't know if you're a goal setter kind of guy, or, I've read a lot about this. I'm just reading a new book called Atomic Habits that talks about that very well. What are your thoughts on goal setting? Do you have anything to say around how leaders should be setting goals, and any words of wisdom around that?
I mean, obviously at the highest level, I'm a big fan of being clear on the outcomes. And one of the things that I'll offer maybe as just a little bit of a learning that we've had is that so often there are goals that are pretty concrete, revenue goals, right? Profit goals, percentage of growth goals. And those metrics are sometimes called, SMART goals, specific, measurable, actionable, time bound. One of the things that we see with leaders is there's often a set of goals that are a little bit more abstract, and they get around enhancing operations, improving technology, and we'll see them get very passionate about setting the goal and miss some of the nuance in what would success look like. And how will we actually know that we hit the target on that, especially if it's a goal that is a team goal, where one member of the team is the executive sponsor, but it's not happening in isolation. It's a goal or an initiative that is integrated with multiple functions or multiple departments. And so our advice would be to make sure that when you write your goal, you really understand the conditions of success, and that you get aligned as a team around that, because that's probably the biggest miss that we see, is team goals that actually are not specific enough. And I'll illustrate it with my own experience of this. About 10 years ago, I was working with one of our team members. His name was Greg. He was running sales at the time, and Greg and I had a shared initiative, and we met on it. We had a very clear goal. Everyone on the team knew the goal. We met every week for at least 1 hour on the goal. We made progress every single week. And at the end of the year, we did what we call game filming, our after action review. And we were with the entire company, and we were doing that. And I'll never forget it. And the person who was running the process, it was not me, our general manager, said, okay, now we got to Rand and Greg's goal, and we need to determine whether we succeeded or not. And almost at the same time, Greg said we nailed it, and I said we completely missed it. It was a complete fail. And so the idea that Greg had his own sense of what success looked like, and I had my own sense, and we never wrote those down and debated them and ultimately got aligned, even though we had the initiative very clearly articulated. Underneath that, there needed to be about 3 to 5 specific conditions that would allow us to either, celebrate or declare defeat and celebrate for the learning. I mean, you can celebrate either way, but right. But I was like really quite sobered by my own learning there. So there's a little bit of tip.
No, that's a good point on getting in line with the goal and what it conceptually means, and coming to a conceptual agreement on what that really looks like between your team members. That's a good distinction there. I also like I don't know if you've heard of Nick Saban's The Process. I think a lot of people talk about goals, but they don't talk about they don't focus on what gets you to the goals enough, right? So it's like Nick Saban won't talk about winning a national championship. He'll talk about the next step in practice, or how well we did that day, or if 10 people have the goal of making $100 million in their business and only 1 or 2 of them made it there, well, they all had the same goal. It wasn't necessarily the goal, but it was the process that steps them in that direction, which is often habits and consistency and all that kind of gritty stuff that isn't sexy or fun, but gets us towards that goal. So you have anything to touch on there?
Yeah, I mean, you just hit on it. As much as any of us would like to believe that, we're going to bring a transformation to our company, or we're going to have a kind of revolutionary change in our business, those stories of true transformations from one sort of state of a business to another in a short period of time, those happen, but they're very, very rare. Most of the time, the transformation that occurs in a business is incremental. I think Jim Collins calls it the 20-mile march, which I just
love. Yeah.
And part of the reason that we have chosen the road less traveled in our own work with leaders is that the request from the marketplace, at least in the world that we play in the United States, and I think this is the case around the world, is the idea that leaders want to be better. That's just universal. Leaders want to be better. They want to serve their stakeholders. They want to serve their employees in ways that allow them to win and succeed and be better. Unfortunately, the industry that I'm a part of, the leadership development, or what I'm going to even more precisely call the leadership training business, attempts to meet that demand with event-based training, which says we are going to have a 1 or 2 day workshop, and you want to be a better communicator, you want to be a better prioritizer of your key initiatives. Come and learn the 1 or 2 days. Maybe you would even go to a program for 5 days at a university, a top university. Unfortunately, those events, while they can be informative, inspiring, while it can be good for networking, that doesn't create, no matter how good the curriculum or teachers are, that doesn't create behavioral change. What creates behavioral change is the 20-mile march. And you asked this question around goal setting. I'm going to extend your question into leadership development, into adult development. And we, just like our initiatives or projects, are ultimately about the incremental steps we call practice. If you're going to learn a musical instrument, you have to practice every week. If you're going to learn martial arts, you have to practice. And our community at the Stagen Leadership Academy is a community of practice. And so, as I said, 52-week practice-based programs are what we do. And and this is a little bit of a stretch for maybe some of your listeners, but we are very sincere about this idea of playing the long game, and where long-termism comes into play, because I believe that we can connect your question around these sort of incremental moves, not just within a quarterly goal or an annual initiative, but ultimately the quarterly goal or annual initiative with how it sets into the broader scope of a decade or 2 decades or 3 decades. So when we talk about leadership training and development and helping leaders create change in themselves so that they can extend that change into and through their organizations, we measure that in decades. And I was asked by someone, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, hey, I understand you work with Greg Massey, the CEO of First United Bank up in Durant, Oklahoma, and Greg and his team are building an incredible conscious business. The book Conscious Capitalism, written by John Mackey and Raj Sisodia, talks at the forward of their paperback version about a handful of mid-sized companies, and Greg's company was in there. And someone said to me, Rand, your team has been working with Greg Massey, he reports, for 9 years. He went through your integral leadership program, and then he continued doing graduate work, and then did coaching work, and then he brought you in to work with his leaders, and he was a TA. But 9 years, that's amazing. How's it going with Greg? And I looked at this person, and I was not joking. I looked at this person and I said, it's too early to tell. It's only been 9 years. And they're like appalled. They're like, what do you mean it's only been 9 years? And I said to him, you got to understand, when I met with Greg and I had my first conversation with him, I said to him, when you think about the future of your organization, when you think about being a leader in this business at the time he's in his 40s, I said, how far out do you see? And he paused and he looked at me and he said, I can go out about 25 years. After about 25 years, things get a little fuzzy. And then he was very genuine. He goes, is that far enough to work with you guys? And I smiled and I was like, of course. So I actually had the luxury of being in a relationship, and I'm still in relationship with Greg. And Greg was 9 years at that point into his development, but in the context of his 25-year vision, not my 25-year vision, he was just getting warmed up. And and I was on a call the other day with about 4 or 5 days ago with the leader of a 4th generation business. And I said to him, tell me about your vision for the future. And he said, well, to be honest with you, Rand, I'm not so worried about the 5th generation because they're they're now in their teens, and we have a sense of who's interested in the business and who's not, as a possibility. So I'm really not that concerned about generation 5. My biggest concern is generation 6. I'll put this in perspective. I'm talking to a leader whose orientation is a stewardship orientation of a business that he simply has the opportunity, and he would say the responsibility, to shepherd that during his lifetime so that he can pass it on to the next generation a little bit better than he found it. And he's doing that. It's a very successful national business. And then he's talking to me about his concern for a generation of leaders who haven't been born yet. Wow. Okay. And so now you got some listeners who are saying, well, that's great for someone who's in a family business, but I work for a company. I'm an employee of a company, and I would say that the bar that I would hold for those leaders is identical, is that we have the opportunity to steward the teams that we're leading, because we are standing on the shoulders of people who came before us in that company, and that could be a Fortune 1000 business. And there will be people that will benefit from what we leave after we're gone. And we could be at that company for 3 years or for 30 years. But this gets at your question of consciousness, leadership consciousness. Our society has become so consumed with short-termism, and we know it's epidemic, and we know it's chronic. And it is, and this is the crazy part, that the short-termism of the strategy to actually maximize profit by focusing on the short term is statistically, and McKinsey just released a 15-year study. It actually is wrong that the management teams that operate with a short-term orientation, and McKinsey has the McKinsey Time Horizon Index, which they are able to look at about how capital deployments are done and how decisions are done for stock prices. It's a very sophisticated and robust methodology, and it concludes, along with lots of other sources, that the actual thesis that short-termism drives higher profit is wrong, that long-termism, where you have to be responsible for the short term, is actually the greater generation of economic benefit to shareholders. And so part of what I am a stand for in our work as a Conscious Capitalism board member, as a volunteer, or as a leader of the Leadership Academy here in Dallas, is how can we help leaders build the capacity for a longer term horizon, whether they're an employee, whether they're an executive, whether they're a founder, family, it doesn't really matter. Leadership is leadership, and I believe we need a consciousness that's longer term. And I'll end this piece with the endorsement. If anybody listening is interested in this idea of long-termism, look up Larry Fink's CEO letter. Larry Fink is the founder and CEO of BlackRock. BlackRock has $6.5 trillion of assets under management. They are the largest asset manager on planet Earth. And Larry Fink sent a letter to the 500 CEOs of the S&P 500 demanding them to lead with a commitment to purpose, a non-financial reason for existence, and a commitment to long-termism. And when Larry Fink is my poster child for long-termism and organizational purpose, the world has changed, because 10 years ago and 20 years ago, we didn't have this kind of credibility standing for these principles. It was a little bit more kind of progressives like Herb Kelleher at Southwest Airlines, and so I'm really encouraged that the capital markets, with people like Larry Fink, are starting to use their brute force to advocate for a different kind of leadership in public companies.
Great. No, that's great. What can leaders do? Kind of maybe a brief couple things they could do to carve out some more time to have this higher thinking discussion with themselves or with their team.
Yeah, I'll start with some really simple techniques that we teach people. One thing that we can encourage all of your listeners to consider is the cost of multitasking. Once again, research is conclusive on this. We are not wired as human beings to be effective at multitasking. When we're multitasking, a multitask might look like this. I'm working on an email. I'm 10 minutes in. It's an important email, and I'm really in flow. My door is open. Somebody walks in and says, "Hey, Rand." I stop what I'm working on. I look up. I answer their question. "Yeah, let's go to lunch at noon." And then I go back to the email, and I have to re-engage my thought process. Or we all can relate with this. I'm on the phone and I'm having a conversation, and someone walks in my office. I cover up the phone. I say, "Hold on a second." I look over at the person. I say, "Yep, lunch at noon." And then I go back to the call and I pause and I go, "What? Where were we?" We all can relate with that. So the cost of multitasking is not actually the cost of the time it takes to move from one activity to the other. The research calls this task switching. are when we switch from one task to another, we have to re-engage the original task. And the cost of this is shocking. It's somewhere between 40 and 60% of decreased productivity. So when you think about your listeners are like, hey, what can I do to reclaim a little bit of time? The easiest technique that I would advocate for is do a little bit of research on single tasking versus multitasking, and start to look for some very simple ways to assert boundaries. Close your door when you're actually got your head down and you're working. Turn off your notifications, okay? And I want to be very clear. Turn them all off. Which ones? Every one of them. Turn off your ringer on your phone. Turn off your email notification. Turn everything off, because when you're doing something and you hear the ding, you hear the text, you hear your phone, you actually then get pulled into that other task. And so often it's hard to not look. It's hard to not get pulled into it. And so that's called we call it a dopamine hit. And what technology companies, and I'm sure you guys, many of you listening know this, technology companies are designing technology as a way to interrupt, because it's about grabbing people's attention. And so if you were to say, okay, Rand, how much time could somebody reclaim by implementing some very simple attention management practices to assert boundaries, turn off notifications. And by the way, you can turn those notifications back on an as-needed basis, but the default I'm suggesting is that they're off. And then you go and check them when you want. We've had clients get back 3, 4, 5 hours a week, every week for the rest of their careers. Think about the compounding benefit of that, by actually learning how to manage their attention. And so that is the low-hanging fruit in reclaiming time. And there, David Allen, who's an author, Getting Things Done, that's just wonderful. He's someone who I would recommend studying. Obviously, we do a lot of, we don't have any books on this yet, but we do a lot of work around attention management in our Leadership Academy. That would be something I would advocate for.
Yeah, Cal Newport has a book called Deep Work. I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but same principle there. Delete your social media, pretty much, that kind of thing, and just focus.
We're all in on there was the slow food movement. And now I just heard about 2 weeks ago about something called the slow content movement. And I just got an email from a company that I get marketing materials from, and the headline of the email was why we broke up with social media. And I loved it. And they're like, you know what? We got caught in the trap of having to put constant content out and having to keep up with the frequency that social media had us believing we had to do, and therefore we sacrificed the quality of our content. And they said, we're done with social media, and they're returning back to a monthly newsletter and using their Vimeo video channel. And they're like, we're going into the slow content movement. So big fan of Cal's work and what he's representing.
For sure. Okay, cool. Well, as we wrap this up, let's do a couple rapid fire questions here. What are you currently reading?
I am currently reading a book that was published in the 1980s, and it's called Finite and Infinite Games. Finite games you play to win, and infinite games that you play to ensure that the game continues. And so it's just absolutely a spectacular book, and it's a short read. Finite and Infinite Games.
All right, we'll look at that. We'll look at that for sure. Yeah, very good. I'm writing that down. So what are you most proud of in your life so far, Rand?
Oh, that's a big question.
One.
What I immediately went to is I'm most proud of my family. I'm married and 2 wonderful girls. And so that sort of is a no-brainer that comes to mind immediately. And what I'm most proud of professionally is the quality of faculty that we've been able to recruit, and the quality of our members, our clients that surround our faculty. I'm just very, very proud of the thousands of members of the Stagen Leadership Academy community, and for what they represent, which is not about me, it's about them or about us. But I'm really proud of the community that we've been able to be a part of building.
Beautiful, yeah. How do you see your legacy? Like, what kind of impact do you want to make while you're here on this earth?
Well, there's a Walt Whitman poem that was the basis of a Apple commercial that some people may be familiar with, and it basically says, the powerful play goes on, and you may contribute a verse, right? The powerful play goes on, and you may contribute a verse. And then in the commercial, Robin Williams' voice says, what will that verse be? So I heard you just ask that question. And I would say that my hope is that we are able to contribute in some way, some small way, me in this lifetime, my team, that has some just incremental impact on the lives of people, and those lives then ripple out to the next generation and the next generation, but just some small contribution to the powerful play, and in whatever way we're called to do. I would say that's not a specific answer. It's a real broad question with a real broad answer.
It's a tough question. I've asked this one a lot of people, and even like some people that are pretty worldly CEOs are like, oh, I don't know, So it's a tough question. I get it. So it sounds like you're off to a good start, creating that ripple effect, right, through all the leaders you're working with. What a great position to be in, to impact leaders who can impact so many other people, right? So there's that ripple effect. It's pretty wide for you. So anyway, well, Rand, thanks so much for coming on, talking a bit about leadership, a bit about Stagen, a bit about life, and whatever else we ended up talking about here during this discussion. Everybody listening, you can check out Stagen.com to learn more about Rand, and I'll link up your social media. I think we talked about social media, but I'll put your LinkedIn profile below here, and if anyone wants to.
And let's put an article out there that on long-term capitalism I wrote for Conscious Company magazine. I think that anyone who'd be interested in learning more about that article.
Send that on over to me, and I'll link it up for sure. Right. So we can do that as well, or anything else you want to link up below this. So any last words before we wrap this up?
I'm not compelled to say any words, but more of a felt sense of just gratitude is what I'm feeling, for the opportunity to talk with you and to share what we're learning. And this is a work in progress with your listeners, and just deep gratitude.
All right. Appreciate that, Rand. All right, everybody. Hope you enjoyed this discussion with Rand Stagen of the Stagen Institute. He's a Leadership Academy. You can check it out at Stagen.com. We'll link that up below here. And we'll catch you on the next one, everybody. Take care.